Good afternoon, good morning, good evening. I'm being streamed at different times for this Quick Takes webinar. I'm David Mandel, the CEO of the Safer Dealer Institute, and I'm really happy to be here again, joining you from Tungus Land in Connecticut in the United States for this Quick Takes 30 minutes. Down and dirty look at pros and cons of strength-based work with domestic violence perpetrators. It's a huge topic. I'm actually quite excited. Been doing a bunch of prep for it, and I hope I do it justice in a short amount of time. This is part of our Quick Take series, and before I go any further, I just want to acknowledge that I'm coming to you from Tungus Land, like I said earlier, and acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land, the Tungus people or the Masako people here in Connecticut, and acknowledge any elders, past, present, or emerging, who are on this call with me, whatever format it's taking. So we get a lot of questions before I dive into a little bit about the Institute. We get a lot of questions about the applicability of the Safer Together model to different approaches in human services and child protection and in therapy. And the model is very supportive because it's very focused on the fundamentals of behaviors. It integrates really well with things like signs of safety, safety organized practice, other different therapeutic models that focus on strengths versus deficits. At the same time, people will often ask, well, what does that mean for work for survivors, for perpetrators? And there's big differences, huge differences. And the main thing I want you to take away from this is that there are a lot of challenges and concerns about anybody trying to apply a strength-based approach to working with domestic violence perpetrators. Really, there should be big caution lights flashing. Basically, that's one of the first headlines and takeaways. And then the second one is, within that caution, there are narrow places where asset-focused or strength-focused work can be useful in creating meaningful, sustainable behavior change that matters, which is always the measure, to adult and child survivors. So that's kind of giving you the kind of quick look at this, and I want you to really be thinking about that as I go through this. For those of you who don't know, this is a series we do every month. There'll be 5 more planned between now and June. That schedule will be released soon. If you don't know the Institute, we're a global organization. We're about systems change, and we're looking to really support service providers, professionals, institutions, organizations, communities, and where the definition says child welfare here. Really think anybody who works with children and families. The model continues to grow in its applications, and geographically, I'll talk in a minute about where we are, but just the work we do kind of comes out through a bunch of different channels, which is, live and remote training, e-learning, webinars like this. We're coming up on our, what I think is our 7th Asia Pacific conference in March, which is both in person and live streaming. We do a conference in May, which will be virtual in the UK, and I'll talk about that at the end. And it looks like October we'll be doing our North American conference. If you don't know our Partner with Survivor podcast, check it out. Check out all our tools, which are on our virtual academy or on our website, but particularly want to underscore the perpetrator pattern mapping tool, which is web-based now, and can be accessed through our virtual academy. And then we do systems work, evaluation, research, and then we have numerous partner agencies all over the world that delivers tens of thousands of hours of training a year, and impacts thousands and thousands of professionals, and through them, tens of thousands of families. So we're really excited about our global network, and this just gives you a small feel for where we're working in North America, in the UK. Our footprint is starting to expand. We did some work in Cyprus this year, in Europe. We're talking to folks in Italy and France and Spain and Belgium. And significant work happening in the Asia Pacific region, whether it's our family court work in Australia to our work in New Zealand, or our kind of burgeoning work in Japan, where I'm about to do a seminar at the end of this week that'll have over 400 participants. So just, again, not quite doing justice, just quickly laying out for those of you who are visually oriented kind of where we're working. Okay. Jumping right in, strength or asset-based work is a major approach in different sectors, and it's not well defined. It's not well operationalized, to be honest, like a lot of things, but it does really talk about focusing on what people are doing well, their resources versus the deficits and the problems. So it tends to be, more client focused. It tends to be assuming a presence of health, certain aspects of health and well-being and abilities. It's less judgmental. It's often less focused on services and more on the person defining what they need. And it can be really helpful for populations that have been marginalized and often left out of mainstream service delivery, because it's often focused on sort of what do they bring to the table? What do they bring through their networks, their culture, through their community, through their own life experiences? And so it's less focused on what the professional defines as what's important, but more what the family does. So it has a lot of, a lot of really positive things associated with it. And our Safe and Together work with survivors, the second principle of the model, the focus on the third critical component around survivor strengths. It's really strongly in alignment with it, the idea of partnering, which focuses on how professionals should partner with survivors, validate their experience, assess their strengths, all built right into partnering. The idea that you should assume that she's safety planning before you ever show up, again, is a strength-based concept. That survivors should be solely defined by their trauma or the harm they've experienced. Again, all these things are part of the Safe and Together model. Along with this, kind of giving moms credit for the things they're doing right. And so we're trying to compensate for the gender bias and also, really understanding that survivors from marginalized communities may engage in protective efforts, acts of resistance that don't fit the definition of mainstream services or systems. And we actively look for those. We train folks in looking for those. So there's really a depth to the model's strength-based approach to working with both adult and child survivors. So again, while not the focus of this quick takes, I really wanted to lay this out, and there'll be another one that really focuses more on this in depth, but I really wanted to start with the perpetrator one this year. So can strength-based approaches be useful with domestic violence perpetrators? The answer is yes, but first, it requires, in some ways, a complete reorientation of our understanding of strengths into the context of the perpetration of coercive control. So I'm going to talk about that, and I can't underscore this too much, because it's a whole different way to think about strengths. It's a whole different way to think about it's not what I think most people think about at all. There's pretty a straightforward sense of, and I'll talk about this, like somebody getting sober, their sobriety, being a strength. And that's not automatically, in the context of coercive control, it shouldn't be assumed automatically to be a strength from the point of view of better outcomes for survivors. Similarly, people having a network of family and friends that support them in a straightforward strength-based perspective, that's a positive, but you need to look more closely, and we'll talk about this in the context of domestic violence, about the nature and the quality of the support as it relates to the domestic violence. So in red, a naive application of a strengths perspective to perpetrators will actually increase their ability to control and manipulate their partners, children, kin, systems, and professionals. So I really want to say that this actually can do harm, that strengths-based perspectives misapplied to domestic violence perpetrators can do harm. And that's sort of, again, a really critical takeaway from this, which is sort of, again, that big red flashing light there that I talked about earlier. And so how do we really understand both the pros and the cons here, and how to kind of think about this? That just like any work that's meaningful and valid with domestic violence perpetrators around those behaviors, that the problem and the solution must be defined by others. So again, a lot of times in strength-based work and sort of client-centered work, there'll be a sense of, well, let the client define the problem. And again, that's often a traditional therapeutic approach, very different in substance abuse. So there's some alignment here with substance abuse work. But really critically, the problem has to be defined by others, whether it's survivors first, which is the most important, but then professionals who are partnered with the survivors, so be able to say to the perpetrator, the problem here is your behavior that's undermining your partner's ability to function as a parent, or your behavior that's harming your kids. That has to be defined externally from that perpetrator, from that client. And that's the responsibility of systems to understand that when we allow perpetrators to define what the problem is, what they define what better looks like, they're just going to do it from a self-centered perspective and what they think is gets them what they want in some sense. So again, the problem must be defined by others. And that success, kind of building on this, that success, and this would be true whether we're talking about men's behavior change, we're talking about anything. So this is a consistent kind of definition that success around domestic violence perpetrators' behavior must be defined by changes for survivors. When I did men's behavior change work, while the man I was working with was sitting in the room, my real client in some sense, the person whose success my actions were measured by, my actions as a professional were measured by, was the survivor safer? Did they have more freedom, self-determination, autonomy? Was their quality of life going up? Was there increased satisfaction? Was there a space for there to be healing from trauma? Whether that because the violence and abuse control had stopped, or was there capacity with the perpetrator to support their partner healing, and that might be through an apology, through taking responsibility, through changing the behavior. Is there increased stability in the family, and is there more nurturance for the children? And so these must remain the measures of success, not the perpetrator's definition of change or better. So again, those of you who are thinking client-centered, strength-based, all those things, you cannot allow domestic violence perpetrators to define better. And we'll talk about that. Survivor perpetrators may have issues like substance misuse, their own trauma history of being, physically, sexually abused as a child, neglected. They may have experienced, trauma related to colonization, racism. Those are real things that they've experienced in their own victimization. And those things need to be attended to just for that person's health and well-being. But part of what we want to break apart here is the assumption that those things getting better automatically translate into better outcomes for survivors, which is not automatically true. I'm not saying there can't be a correlation that somebody's sobriety can't make the likelihood of behavior change increased, which I think overall it's a condition for it. But you cannot automatically assume, and that's one of the points here, that this thing like sobriety, this thing like going to counseling, that automatically translates into better outcomes for survivors. And that's so critical to any of these approaches, that it has to be kind of a show me the change, not show me that he attended the session. Show me what's different for the survivor. Can she go to work? Can she have contact with her family? Is he stopped blaming her? Instead of saying, well, look, he's back to work, and that's a really positive thing. In the context of money coming into his hand, that may be true. Maybe for him, it's a sense of meaning. But does that automatically, you have to ask the separate question, does that automatically make things better for the adult and child survivors? And in some cases, in a moment, I'll talk about how it actually can increase control. Some of the things we think of success and strengths may increase control by the perpetrator. So it must be recognized that perpetrators often start with an advantage in strength. And what does that mean? That he may use his status or strengths to seduce, control, manipulate his partner, to engage in a relationship with him in the first place. It may be money, it may be status. Maybe somebody saying, look, I've got a house, come and move in with me, bring your kids after your divorce. And so that may begin the part of the entrapment process. And so again, that stable housing may be part of what gives him an advantage and part of the control. Sponsoring a partner who's emigrating to a country, again, may be seen as a strength. If we're talking about male perpetrators and female victims, that sexist attitudes in the culture and community, working within a patriarchal, let's say, religious system, that person may start with strengths in terms of status and sort of cultural collateral. And so it's really important to understand that that when we look at perpetrators, that we may need to be thinking about, so how did they start out with certain things that we would refer to as strengths? And even when we're talking about male perpetrators, low expectations around parenting often translates into quote unquote strengths. So what I mean by that is you do less if you have low expectations of somebody. Them doing less than the other person means they get more credit. Just showing up for the appointment, for visits. A lot of times people say, oh, he showed up to all the visits. And that's great, but that's just the bare bones at the beginning. That's what's the quality of the parenting, what's the quality of interaction with the kids, how is he attending to the kids' emotional needs. That's the standard we're often going to be evaluating moms on. But again, it's an advantage to be held to a lower standard, if that makes sense. So again, it's important to recognize that built into the dynamics of coercive control, there's often this privileging of the perpetrator's presentation, their resources, their status, and that may be there from the start. And so strengths are often the source and the result of the coercive control. So I talked about it as the source, but it's a way to think about it is they're often that having a job, having employment, owning the house, having the contract on the apartment, all those things need to be seen as through the lens of how do they help the entrapment, how do they help create the control, and that's not the lens. It's by rethinking the entire concept of strengths. He has a job, she doesn't. Well, now let's talk about the result of coercive control. If I'm sabotaging your work, I may have a stable work history, you may not. That may be perceived as a strength. If I undercut your housing, force you to move, force you to flee in the middle of the night to go to a refuge or shelter with the kids, that you're going to show up with deficits around housing. If I traumatize you, you may have deficits, quote unquote, around mental health, around substance use, because we know survivors are having those issues at greater rates than their non-abused peers. That put side by side, the perpetrator may present better and may be perceived as having greater strength. So we've seen in family court, the perpetrator getting kids because he's got stable housing, he's got the nice house. Well, he's controlled her, he's cut her off from income, he's cut her off from working, he's bankrupted around legal battles, and so she doesn't have the resources or quote unquote the strengths or the assets that he has. And so again, we really need to be very careful around these things, because coercive controllers, people who use domestic violence, may present, if used naively, with a lot of strengths. And so if he doesn't engage in mental health, if he's avoided mental health counseling, he's not a trauma survivor in the relationship, he may be a trauma survivor in other ways, but he may be perceived as being more competent, more together, more resourceful, and especially if he's marginalized the other parent's relationship with the kids, he may be seen as having a better relationship with the kids. And so, it's really important, again, to have a contextualized, non-naive look at these things and really kind of turn this concept of strengths over and over again and look at it in the context of domestic violence and control. So what does strength-based work what could it look like, and what are some of the caveats around it? One is it doesn't replace other interventions or consequences, right? So this doesn't take the place of of DVOs, restraining orders, protective orders, arrests, incarceration, only applies to someone who's willing to genuinely engage and to that aspect of the work. Doesn't guarantee change or safety and doesn't require any contact with survivor children. I think a lot of times anybody thinks about work with perpetrators, we have to remind them that perpetrators have to do their own work and it doesn't require the relationship to be continuing. And I think that's so key. It must follow on from perpetrator pattern-based assessment that includes coercive control, actions taken to harm the children, the impact of those behaviors on child, partner, family functioning. What that means is you can't even try to focus on the how, and I'll talk about the how associated with this, until you know the what. What did this person do? What's their pattern? What's the harm it's caused? Because that's what needs to change, and that's what gives us the measure of success. So that's that objective behavioral framework that the model, the safety of the model is based on, that domestic violence reform work is based on, that is so critical. And then when we talk about accountability, you can't have accountability with male perpetrators around parenting without increasing your expectations for them as parents. So again, this is all still connected to the larger Safe and Together framework, the larger approach of DV-informed practice. And so it sits within the Safe and Together framework. So you have to have that DV-informed practice as a foundation for any time you want to kind of look at strength-based work with perpetrators in that very narrow, contextualized way, which focuses on the how of change. It does assume that the perpetrator may have internal and external resources to help them achieve meaningful, sustainable behavior change. They may not. And again, to do strength-based work, you have to have somebody who engages and wants to really change. Doesn't mean every step is easy or it's a straight line, but we have to be looking at sort of it's focused on the how, not the what. And so what are just a few examples of this? A few examples of this can be having that person examine where they've acted nonviolently or in a non-controlling manner, and then applying those behaviors more consistently, especially in circumstances where there's prior use of control and violence. And when I used to run men's behavior change groups, I would ask this question. We do this check-in question each week, which is, in the last week, were there times you acted nonviolent and non-controllingly, where in the past, in the same circumstances, so let's assume, his partner going out with her girlfriends, that you would have acted abusive, controlling, or violently. And so you're not just looking for, we had a week without violence. It's actually much more specific to, when are you acting in a non-controlling way, and that actually is work for you. And so it's almost like saying to somebody, well, under this circumstance where you're afraid of losing your partner, talk us through how you actually handled that without being abusive or controlling. And then how can we apply that out to more and more circumstances? It could be somebody saying, how do you apply your work on sobriety and AA principles around powerlessness? How do you apply that to your relationship, not just to alcohol, and just say, I can't control, my partner, and I need to understand what's in my control and what's out of my control, and my partner's behavior is out of my control. So again, it's about engaging them with their resources and what they have in their history, but in this part, focusing on creating positive change by expanding out their ability to apply what they've already done positively in more and more circumstances. And then, it takes the form of asking questions that are like this, which is, instead of just saying, let's talk about what strengths. So, this person has a resource. The question has to be more targeted. What specific strengths and resources does father have that might support positive change around his violence and abuse? So again, you're targeting the pattern of behavior, which you need to know. And so here's an example. It's not, does he have a supportive kin network? But the question is, does he have a kin network that would support the goals of accountability for the harm he's caused, that will support him in behaviors that increase family safety, stability, repair, of that harm and positive parenting, for instance. And so it's very targeted. It's very targeted because you can have a relative, so this is an example, who actually supports you in being abusive and controlling. They could be actually part of your network of entrapment, or you could have somebody who intervenes. And I was just talking yesterday with Jackie Ruck about our Asia Pacific regional manager about a case where an elder, this man's father came and was there with the worker and said, it's not okay that you're acting this way to him during an intervention. And you can imagine that happening in the converse, where a family member supports and blames the victim and does that. So again, kin network, the presence of a kin network doesn't automatically mean a strength when viewed through the lens of coercive control and behavior change. And in some sense, it's that simple to understand and to contextualize. So similarly, just again, because mental health and substance misuse are such a big topic in the family court and child protection, for instance, that we have to really be on the lookout that perpetrators will take and wave around going to a treatment program, going to see a therapist, going to talk to somebody, maybe even gaining sobriety, and say that automatically it leads to them being a better parent, not controlling, not abusive. But we have to ask the question: does it create real meaningful change, end of control, repair of damage, more accountability? So if I've gotten sober, have I stopped my abuse as I've gotten sober? Have I been able to hear my partner, understand the damage I've done, listen to them, respect them more, communicate more respectfully and better, be there for my kids in their needs, not in what I've seen is people saying, oh, I'm sober now you can't bring up the past. That's all in the past. I don't want to talk about it. I'm moving on. And so you have to move on too. So again, sort of this idea that my sobriety is automatically a strength and will feel like a lack of, is good for the family, really has to be examined. I've definitely seen survivors say, I liked him better when he was drinking because his abstinence, and I want to call it sobriety, didn't lead to real behavior change, didn't lead to real meaningful improvement in quality of life. Or so again, do you see that sobriety, that going to counseling, leads to more control through systems like family court? I'm going to court and saying, look at me, I'm doing this. I'm getting better, she isn't. So again, it's really important to kind of look at this through that lens. So this webinar is about pros and cons. It's been about pros and cons. And so I want to say this is much more heavily on the con side, that there's a real and likely danger that a naive and decontextualized focus on positive or strengths with perpetrators will lead to child protection, family court, and others being manipulated into supporting the perpetrator's coercive control, being manipulated, so making things worse, increasing their coercive control of the family, or the degradation of the partnership potential with the survivor. So not only does it increase the perpetrator's power, but the survivor becomes more distrustful of systems. And because of this, because the naive approach, this sort of, well, I'm just going to be hoodwinked by him. He's just going to show up and show his counseling appointments and a letter from his counselor showing up. And that's going to be just seen as, look, he's a great dad. And that not only gives him power, but it degrades the relationship with the survivor, because we're seen as not understanding, really seeing and being used. And in some cases that's absolutely true. So the survivor is really worried that we don't see the reality of his violence and its effects, and that they're being overlooked or minimized in favor of his positive. So I really want people to really be extremely cautious whenever you're looking. And there's a lot of these frameworks out there, particularly in child protection, where people are looking at strengths and want to be, from a social work perspective, strength-based, to be really skeptical, really cautious, really thoughtful about this, and really look at it very closely. So that's the end of sort of the presentation. One of the things that we have that can help with constructive work with perpetrators is this Choose to Change behavior guide, which is about building safe and strong networks. So it speaks to this issue about networks that are specifically focused on helping him end his violence and his control. So it's a great resource. So it's at safefortheotherinstitute.com. Our mapping tool, again, is a way to foundationally focus on this. And we've got a one-time price for now, or forever pricing, so you can go online and purchase it and use it for the life of the tool, and not have to pay a subscription anymore. But really gives the foundation of things. I've been saying this for about 2 years. This is coming. We're actually finalizing in the last few weeks of getting this out here, and to hopefully by the end of the first quarter, beginning of second quarter, this will be available this year. If you're looking for educational resources, again, the mapping tool, working with men as parents, e-learning course in our virtual academy. Podcasts will always give you information about these topics and more. We'll be doing a podcast on this subject soon. If you're in the Asia Pacific region, around the corner is our conference. Attendance is kind of jumping. We hope to exceed last year. There's still slots open. You can also attend virtually from anywhere in the world. And the entire program is streaming, including master classes. So check it out. If you're in the European area, which means you can also get this easily in North America because of the time things, our European conferences here is completely virtual, May 8th through 10th. And finally, and I can show this to you because I've got the review copy. Oh, I don't know if you can see it there. Let's see. There it goes. This is hard. There you go. The book is here in my hands and will be coming out later this month in January. So I hope you purchase it when it's available. And there's the contact information for us. Thank you for joining me, and keep an eye out for the other quick takes that will be coming over the next few months.